Okay. We're ready to start our fourth talk of the day. We're very happy to have with us Raj Chetty, who's the William Ackman Professor of Public Economics at Harvard. He's a true leader on the field of equality and opportunity, which I think is what we're going to hear about today. In the past, Raj received quite a few honors, in particular the John Bates Clark Medal, which is the most important prize in economics under the age of 40, a MacArthur Fellowship, the Infosys Prize, and some others. And we're looking forward to this talk. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Yana. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk with all of you. So I'm going to talk, as Yana mentioned, about work I've been doing with my research team on the science of economic opportunity. I'm going to talk about, specifically in the context of this conference, how modern large-scale data, big data, is helping us understand these questions of inequality and opportunity with much greater precision than was previously possible in the social sciences. But I want to start at a bigger picture scale to motivate the topic that I'm going to talk about for the next hour by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a complex concept. It has different meanings to different people. I'm going to distill it in this first slide here to one key aspect, which I think is a cornerstone of what America is about, at least in the eyes of many citizens and immigrants like myself, which is that at least we aspire to be a country where through hard work, any child has the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents to achieve a higher standard of living. And so in a paper some colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration, measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids and parents' incomes in their mid-30s, adjusting for inflation, and just calculating that statistic of what fraction of kids go on to earn more than their parents by the year in which they're born. Now, if you had the right data to do this, this would be a trivial calculation. In practice, you don't actually have longitudinal data linking parents and kids going far back historically. So what the paper is about methodologically is how you can use cross-sectional data to make some progress despite those challenges. I'm not going to dwell on that methodological issue here. Let me just jump to the punchline. What you can see here is that for kids born in the middle of the last century in the US back in 1940, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of children, we estimate, went on to earn more than their parents did at that time. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, or in their mid-30s around now, when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. So that trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself, because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we'd like to understand. I think it's also of much broader social and political interest, because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of frustration that people around the US express, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead. And that's reflected, if you look at the data, in political outcomes and various things that are, I think, very important today. So motivated by that graph, what I want to talk about today is the focus of what my research and this research group I direct, Opportunity Insights here at Harvard, just understanding basically what is driving the fading of the American dream, and more broadly, what can increase opportunity, particularly for kids from lower income, disadvantaged backgrounds, help them rise up in the income distribution. So that question, of course, is an age-old question in the social sciences, spanning economics, sociology, and a number of other disciplines. People have been interested in these issues for a very long time. And there's a long literature going back in sociology to early work by people like Blau and Duncan, and the economics literature, Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes and many others, that investigates these issues. That earlier literature, much of it was theoretical, some of it was empirical, based on small-scale surveys following a few hundred or a few thousand people over time. I think people gleaned quite a bit of insight from that, but there's a limit to what you can learn from that kind of data. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a body of recent work that our team has been doing in conjunction with many others now doing this sort of research that makes use of big data, large-scale administrative data, basically, such as tax records, social network data, et cetera, to make further progress on understanding the science of economic opportunity. So as I'll hope to illustrate in the next hour, I think that kind of data has been beneficial to us in this field in two key ways. First, we can study the determinants of economic opportunity much more precisely than we could previously by disaggregating the data much more finely than that national graph that I started out with. That turns out to be very useful, as you'll see in a second. And second, from a methodological point of view, it's going to allow us to develop new methods of causal inference using quasi-experimental techniques that are really useful to uncover mechanisms. So I think a lot of the focus of this conference and the big data, literature, data science more generally has been on prediction and machine learning problems and so on. Here in this talk, I'm going to mainly focus on the use of large-scale data for causal inference, which is going to be very relevant for the kinds of problems that I'm interested in. But I'll come back at the end to just talk about how I think some of the issues maybe some of you here are more interested in methodologically can be helpful in this context as well. So what I'm going to do is, rather than presenting one specific paper in detail, I'm going to try to give you an overview of some of the highlights in this field, presenting in particular a series of papers that I've written with many collaborators here at Harvard and elsewhere: John Friedman, Nathan Hendrick, Matt Jackson at Stanford, Larry Katz, Johannes Strobel, and a number of others. So let me start with this first piece of data on how economic mobility varies across areas in the United States. So disaggregating the national picture geographically. And so first, let me take a second to describe how we construct this map that I'm showing you here, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we do here is take data on 20 million kids, essentially all kids born in the US in the late 1970s, early 1980s. We obtain data from anonymized tax returns that allows us to link them back to their parents. How can you do that? Any of you who filed a tax return and have kids, you know that you have to write your kid's social security number to claim them as a dependent. So using that information, we're able to link 99% of children in the US back to their parents and back to the specific place in which they grew up. And then we divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculate a simple statistic. We ask, what is the average household income in adulthood at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families, which I'm going to define for the purposes of this talk as families at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which corresponds to a household income of about $27,000 a year. So think of this as take a set of kids who are growing up in families making $27,000 a year, follow them over time, look at their 1040 tax filings when they're 35 years old. How much are they reporting on average on those 1040 tax returns? For example, in the Boston area, you can see that number is 36,800.
So these are kids born in Boston, or
these are
right
kids
now in Boston?
No, who grew up in Boston. Yeah.
Regardless of where they are now.
Regardless of where they are.
Thank you.
So question, this 27,000 number, that's like a national average.
No, so the 27,000 is the thing we're conditioning on.
I know, so but that's the 25th
Fixed to
percentile.
combination, national.
But why not do it like bottom 25th percentile
Yeah.
where they grew up?
You could. So I mean, I think it depends on what question you're trying to ask, right? So you could construct basically measures of relative mobility within each area, but I think it ties back to Yanai's question, which is in a global labor market, and I'll talk about this in a second. You know, take some of these places like in rural Iowa, where kids seem to be doing really well, like the highest upward mobility places. A lot of those kids who are extremely successful in a place like Dubuque, Iowa, who are reaching the top of the income distribution, they're not still living there. You can't be earning, there are not that many jobs that pay you $150,000 a year in rural Iowa, right? So they're living in Chicago or New York, et cetera. So the power of these data at some level is that usually you have attrition when people move across places in surveys. Here you get everyone no matter where they go. And that fact already, I think we're touching upon a key lesson that I'll get into in more detail in a second, which is what really seems to matter is where you grow up, not where you live as an adult. It's that childhood environment that really seems to drive these differences in people's outcomes. So we're doing that for a deliberate reason, partly because of this mobility. Yeah.
But then I think I have a follow-up to what he's asking, because if I think what I understood of what he's asking is you are not equally suffering or poor if you grew up at 27K in Iowa than 27K in SF.
It depends upon how you think about it. I mean, there's a debate on that actually in the economics literature, which our colleague Ed Glazer is actively involved in. One view is exactly yours, that, 27K in Iowa makes you better off. In SF or in New York, the other view is wages, cost of living are higher because there are real amenities to living in those places, maybe access to resources, schools, other things that benefit people. I mean, I view that as an empirical question. Is it a pure cost, or are you paying for something that has some amenity value to you that ends up improving your utilities, the way we would think about it in economics? I think it's not totally obvious, like same thing.
Can I ask just a question about the first slide?
Yeah, please.
I'm sorry, this is a bit late, but I was a bit confused about the first slide. So this is a percentage of children earning more than pounds. Am I being corrected for inflation?
Yes, in real terms.
But is that really a measure for like mobility? Because the economy was just booming in the 40s.
That's a good question.
And so everyone can become richer and you're not moving up.
So as part of this paper, I skipped over this, but part of what we do in this paper is exactly analyze that question. So there are two key drivers of economic upward mobility defined in this absolute way. One is just economic growth, as you're pointing out. If you have more overall GDP growth, it's going to be easier for the kids to out-earn their parents. But the other key thing is the distribution of that growth. So take the extreme case where you have a lot of growth, but it all goes to Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, then you're still going to end up with 50% of kids doing better than their parents. So what we do in the paper is basically ask what fraction of this decline is due to the decline in GDP growth rates. GDP growth rates are about 1% lower in real terms in the past 30 years relative to the middle of the last century. How much does that account for relative to the very different distribution of growth today relative to the past? And it turns out 2/3 of it is due to the distribution of growth. 1/3 is due to change in the aggregate growth rate.
So if instead I had looked at the percentage of kids growing up in the bottom 25% that arrive in the top 25%, which was what I was thinking about mobility, you would see the same trend of
You
decline.
would not see the same exact, I mean, that is changing other things as well, because here the reference point is your parents, which actually turns out to be quite important. So think of that as a relative rank mobility, rank measure of mobility. And so, yes, you would see some decline there, but it's not going to be as stark as this. Part of what's going on here is it's not just that, growth rates are falling. I mean, I think the key thing to say is, even if you imagine an economy where the growth rates were exactly the same as in the past, you would end up with 2/3 of the decline for this statistic. What fraction of kids out-earn their parents? Because a lot of that growth that's occurring is going to a very small fraction of people. And as a result, the kids are not doing better than their parents. So that's, I think, a key aspect of what's going on. It's going to tie into what I'm going to talk about in the subsequent slides on why that distribution of growth has become so unequal, and in particular, why wages are growing so slowly at the bottom of the distribution. That's really the key thing that's driving this.
Excuse me, you're out of this whole.
Okay, let me come over here. All right, so let me get back to this map. So we've talked about, how this is constructed. Now, the key thing which you can see for yourself is that there's a lot of variation across different parts of the US in children's chances of doing well. You can see that just by looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of the map. To just call out some examples, I mentioned Iowa before, like Dubuque, Iowa, where kids growing up in families making about $27,000 a year are making $45,000 or $50,000 on average in the next generation. There are other places like Charlotte, North Carolina, where remarkably in the next generation, in their mid-30s, kids have average household incomes that are actually lower than where their parents were. And that's kind of amazing given the amount of economic growth that's happened in the US in general and Charlotte in particular over the past 30 years. So there are big differences across the US and children's chances of rising up. Now, in this map, I think you naturally look at the broad regional variation, the Southeast versus the rural Midwest, parts of the coasts and so on. Turns out, in subsequent work, we zoom in to look at these data at a much finer geographic level. So you can look at these statistics at the census tract level. So here, there's some interesting statistical problems that arise because now although you have a lot of data, you have so many small cells that various issues arise. You have some places that have relatively few people in certain cohorts and certain racial groups and so on. So you can see why it starts to become important to think about things like smoothing. How are you going to not literally non-parametrically calculate these conditional means, but actually think about how you use the data more effectively. So we do various things in the background. I'm not going to dwell on that here. There are also some interesting There's a recent econometrics literature that's developed around exactly these data about multiple comparisons. So this is a situation where multiple hypothesis testing issues become very important. Because if you're trying to compare all these different census tracts and ask which ones are better and which ones are worse, it's a very high dimensional set of comparisons, and you can see how that creates various complications. Anyway, so taking all that, as given, these statistics, they have quite a bit of reliability, even at this level of granularity. So each census tract has about 4,000 people. So they're very fine definition of neighborhoods, right? So in Cambridge, for example, to give you a sense of scale, there are 30 census tracts. So it's really good about dividing Cambridge in a very narrow way. And so in each of those places, we're computing those exact same statistics. One thing I'll notice from a statistical point of view, you might be worried about noise in these estimates, like as I was alluding to earlier. So we do a bunch of work thinking about that. One statistic that's useful to keep in mind is that the reliability, the signal to noise, signal variance to total variance ratio of these estimates is about 0.9. So the vast majority of the variation is signal rather than noise. And you can see that, just directly by using split samples. For example, if you split the data randomly into two or look at different cohorts, you get very stable pictures. You can also kind of see that by the clustering of the colors. These are independent estimates across each tract. Just the fact that you see those clusters when you have independent estimates kind of tells you that there can't be a tremendous amount of noise. Okay, so what do we see from this? The first very simple point is the map of New York, of course. The spectrum of colors, we haven't changed the color scale here, is the same as what I was showing you at the national level. So that itself, I think, is an important point about how this all works. The differences that we're seeing in economic mobility in the US, they're not about broad state level differences or differences across cities, labor market policies, et cetera. It's often about one side of the street versus the other side of the street. You go 2 miles down the road in New York, it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of economic mobility. So the roots of these differences in outcomes are hyper-local, which tells us something about the process, perhaps, through which these differences are emerging. You had a question?
Yeah, so I'm sort of thinking a bit about how these cells are constructed,
Yeah.
right? Because that really, like over there, I see a very sharp boundary between top right,
Yes.
Like dark blue to
Yes.
dark red, right?
Yes.
And if at that boundary I just drew the cell differently, you would see an
Smudge,
color, right?
basically,
And
yeah.
that if you have enough of those changes, your downstream
Yes.
statistics and
Yeah,
comparisons, everything changes.
Yeah. So what's the logic of
Yeah.
that? So we didn't pick this geographic unit, right? So census tracts are supposedly chosen by the Census Bureau to define some notion of neighborhood that has some logic to it, sometimes divided by a highway or a river or something else. Obviously, that's not always going to be the case. Historically, what's happened in the US is what's driving some of these extremely sharp divides that you see here are actually, very sharp changes across boundaries that are often related to race. And so, you've got basically on one side of the street, the black part of the city, and the other side of the street, the white or Asian part of the city. And there are enormous differences in outcomes by race in these data. And that's part of what's going on. So you're absolutely right that the geographic unit is going to affect what you end up seeing here. Our sense is there's some logic, at least somebody had some logic in picking these units. But I actually think an interesting, completely different way to approach the data would be to view each person as a point and then let the data sort of tell you what the right notion of the neighborhoods are, rather than imposing the structure, which I think would be a quite interesting problem to work on. I haven't seen anyone.
In Midtown New York, be less than 20,000.
Like over here,
In the middle of New York.
right here, places like this. But remember, so that also raises an interesting methodological issue. So this is not the average incomes of people living there. This is a prediction of how kids who grow up in low-income families would do if they lived there. The reason I say would do is because, in fact, there's basically nobody who is at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution in Manhattan. So how do we have a number there, I think is really the way to think about the question, and not why is that dot red. And there, what we're actually doing in the background, I was mentioning earlier when I was saying smoothing, what we're doing is fitting a smooth function. So basically relating the outcomes of kids to parent income percentile within each of these cells. In some of the cells, there's no data towards the bottom, because there's nobody who's very poor in Midtown Manhattan. We're just taking an extrapolation out to the 25th percentile in those places. So it's saying in a place like Beverly Hills or in a place like Manhattan, how would a kid who is at the 25th percentile do? Now, obviously you have to take that with a grain of salt because that's an extrapolation from the data we actually have at higher levels of income. But that, take it for what it's worth. You can look at just the places where you have larger low income populations. If you don't want to take those extrapolations out. Okay, so
in places where you actually have data on the entire scale, is the smoothness assumption actually?
yeah, I mean, our
hold there?
best sense when we look at larger cells is what we're doing works quite well.
I see.
And tried various different estimators, this seems to minimize MSU, basically, that's the way we've chosen this. Yes,
Very quickly, what's the significance of yellow? Obviously, for K, is that like inflation growth, but
what's the
I'm
significance
just
of?
wondering what's the center of this color scale, if that's significant.
Yeah, there's nothing, no, it's just tried to pick some pretty colors that go from red to green, I guess.
I'm wondering what it would look like if you kind of send this random average, because I'm just very interested in how it's like very blue or very red, there's very little.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I don't know if that's partly an optics thing or the fact that there is actually a very high degree of variance here, right? So, I mean, as you're kind of noting, you end up with some places that look terrific and some places that look terrible.
There's very like polarized.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is actually a reality. Yeah, so that's a good point. All right, so we've seen that these differences are emerging at a very local level. All of this that I've shown you so far is obviously just descriptive statistics, trying to characterize what these patterns look like. So now I want to turn to what I see as the next key question in understanding what's going on here, which is trying to distinguish between causal effects of place, showing you that there are these big differences across neighborhoods. Is that driven by the causal effect of growing up in one place versus another place? Or is that just about selection or sorting? Different types of people live in different places, different types of people live in Midtown Manhattan versus Queens versus Bronx, etc. They differ on race, ethnicity, education, wealth, is that why we're seeing these differences across places? This question is an age-old question in the social sciences. It relates basically to the classic debates about nature versus nurture. How important is environment in shaping people's outcomes? It's again a question that people have grappled with for a very long time. And my sense is that the literature has not been that conclusive, largely due to data limitations. And it's again, I think, a case where massive data sets can help us make progress in understanding what's going on. So I'm going to talk about some work I've done with our former colleague Nathan Hendren, where we try to identify the causal effects of these places by doing what I think is an intuitive exercise. Intuitively, the question we want to ask is, if I took a kid and randomly put that kid in one of the red colored parts of the maps that I was showing you versus the blue-green colored parts, would I see different long-term outcomes for that child? That's essentially the question we want to ask, right? So what we're going to do is try to approximate that kind of ideal experiment quasi-experimentally by looking at families that move across areas in observational data. Millions of families that are making these kinds of moves that we can see in the tax data. Now, of course, those moves are not chosen randomly. The people who choose to move to certain parts of New York may not be comparable to the people who choose to move to other parts of New York. But what we're going to do is, I'll show in a second, is exploit variation in the timing of the moves between families who move between the exact same places in order to identify causal effects under what we think is a plausible identification assumption that we evaluate extensively. So let me show you how this works in a couple of steps. So I'll start with this plot here. So what we're doing here is taking a set of kids who move from one neighborhood to another neighborhood when they're exactly 5 years old. And on the x-axis is the difference in the outcomes of non-movers, kids who grew up from birth in the destination versus the origin. So think of being on the far right as going from a place that was in the dark red to the darkest blue. And think of being on the far left as making the reverse move, moving from a place where kids were generally doing very well to a place where in the observational data kids are doing much worse. Now what we're plotting on the y-axis is the average income rank measured at age 24 for the kids who moved at age 5 to these places, for the movers themselves. And this is a bin scatter plot where we've divided the X variable into 20 equal sized bins. And then we're just plotting the conditional mean of the Y variable within each of those bins, all right? So what you can see very clearly is there's a strong positive relationship here. When kids move to places where the people who are already living there have better outcomes, they themselves do better. When they move to worse places, they do worse. That is consistent with the idea that there's a causal effect of moving to a better place. Of course, it's not conclusive because one worries that the types of people who are moving to the better places are different from the types of people who are moving to the worst places. So how can we do better?
Is
So
this, to what extent do we think this is about I live in a place where other people do well, so some of them are gonna be my friends and they're gonna, even if I do less well than them at school or whatever, when I'm 24, one of them is gonna do me a favor and get me a job.
okay, I'm gonna show you some evidence that's actually consistent with that. So I think part of the mechanism here is about connections and peer influence.
Mhm.
It may not be quite that sort of the favor connotation is maybe not the most positive one, but it, I think along those lines.
Yeah,
it
okay.
seems like very plausible.
Thanks.
So before we get there, so Yanai's interpretation is kind of presuming that there's a causal effect here, which is what I'm going to argue, but let me take a minute to just make that argument. So this was for the kids who move when they're exactly 5 years old. So now what I want to do is replicate this analysis for kids who move at different ages, where I'm going to take that slope, going back to this chart, notice the slope is 0.815 here when you move when you're 5 years old, right? So let's do that same exact analysis, not just for 5-year-olds, but for 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and so on. That orange dot slope of 0.81 is what I showed you on the previous slide. So imagine drawing that same plot age by age and plotting the slopes. This is the pattern you get in the data. So what do you see here? I think there are two key aspects of this. First, remember that we're measuring income, we're measuring the outcome at age 24. So even when your parents move to a better place after you're 24, we're seeing a positive slope of about 0.3. That has to be a selection effect. It can't be that when your parents move to a better place when you're 28, that it affects your income when you're 24. Obviously, that's a selection effect. Now, the key thing we're going to assume is that that selection effect is constant by age, right? So this is, in any quasi-experimental analysis, of course, there's going to be some identification assumption that's going to make this as good as an experiment. The key assumption that we're going to make here is that those selection effects, that 0.35 effect, if we could observe it at all ages, which we of course can't, that we would see a horizontal line here. Under that assumption, that's a strong assumption, I'm going to come back to explain why I think that's plausible in a second. If we make that assumption, then any difference that we see here between these dots and that horizontal line can be interpreted as the causal effect of place, right? Because I've got that constant 0.35 causal effect. Everything else reflects the causal effect. And in particular, this clear declining pattern suggests that there's an exposure or dosage effect of growing up in a better area. If you move at a younger age to one of those blue-green colored areas, you do better in the long run. If you move when you're 15 or when you're 20, you get less of a gain. But importantly, every extra year seems to help. So like this shape, I think, is actually quite important in the policy debate. Some of you might know there's a lot of focus on very early childhood intervention. So some of our colleagues like Jim Heckman argue that it's the very earliest ages, before age 3 or 4 that really matter, and things are kind of really set in stone after that point. This doesn't seem consistent with that, because even if you move to a better place when you're 10 instead of 20, there's an enormous change in your outcomes.
Seems to me that the early one is sort of more about cognitive, so the information asymmetry that you have in place that you don't really know, you don't have access to opportunities.
Yes.
Which clearly could happen at every stage.
I think that's right. So there could be different mechanisms at play at different points, and I'll show some evidence that I think looks consistent with that in a second. Yeah.
Is there also, forgive my ignorance, there's also a study that was like, it's a few decades old, I think, the University of Texas, the doctors, where they admitted the bottom half of the bottom quartile of the people that would have never gotten in, and didn't say they actually shouldn't have gotten in, but by the time they all graduated, 70% of them got in. And then the other 30% 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 got you could not tell
Tell the
apart the
difference.
people, yeah, and so like as my primary care physician like to tell me, even the last person in my class is called doctor. Which
Yeah.
makes me go, wait, where did you graduate?
Yeah. If that kind of thing is consistent with the evidence that I'm showing you here, whether you can completely level the playing field like that in college, I'm skeptical of that. I'll show you evidence in that vein in a second. But this is broadly consistent with that theme, that environment seems to matter quite a bit. Okay, so let me, in an economics audience at this point, you get, I promised me there'd be less questions.
Sorry, this is
No, but I was gonna say there'd be many questions now arguing that this identification assumption is not valid. So I'm prepared with a number of things on that, but let me just briefly summarize here. So, the worry with this kind of assumption, like it's useful to think about what would make this go wrong, right? So to make this go wrong is if parents who move to better places when their kids are young are, say, more educated, more informed, wealthier than parents who move to better places when their kids are older, which might be an intuitive hypothesis. That would confound this analysis because you don't have an apples to apples comparison as you look across this chart, basically, in terms of potential outcomes. So number of things you can do on that. I'm not going to spend time showing you that evidence, but here's one simple thing. There's enough data here that you can look at siblings who move together. So imagine a family now that moves with a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. You can basically put in family fixed effects when you're doing this analysis, and remarkably, you get almost the identical graph back when you're solely identifying with across sibling comparisons. So the 3-year-old does better than the 7-year-old, or the difference in the siblings' outcomes is exactly proportional to the age gap between the siblings. So that rules out simple confounders like, just differences in the types of families who are moving when the kids are young versus old. There are a number of other things that we do in that vein. Let me not get into that in the interest of time, but happy to talk more afterward. Based on that kind of evidence, we think this identification assumption seems quite plausible. And so we think there's this strong causal effect of childhood exposure to better neighborhoods from this study. Now, interestingly, since we put out that work about 6-7 years ago, that finding has since been replicated very broadly using a number of different research designs, using pure experimental methods, using housing voucher random assignment, to a quasi-experimental method used by an economist named Eric Chin using public housing demolitions in different countries and so on. You always find this very clear dosage effect, which I think was not evident in the prior literature where people were just looking for level effects of neighborhoods. And in fact, there had been a gold standard study of the moving to opportunity experiment, this randomized experiment conducted in the 1990s by many different social scientists, where they basically concluded that neighborhoods did not seem to matter. And they were looking there at adults' outcomes because they were tracking people over time using surveys. And naturally, when you're tracking people over time using surveys, that's very expensive. So you're going to focus on people whose outcomes you can measure most quickly. If a kid moves when they're 5 years old, it takes 20 years till you can see how they're doing as an adult. So you're not going to focus on that subgroup. And if you think about the model that I'm showing you here, you're going to miss the causal effects because you don't see any causal effects for the people who are moving at older ages. You really only see the causal effects if you move young enough to get that dosage. So that's another good example where modern data, where we're not using surveys anymore, we're linking to administrative records, we're able to see these really long-term impacts and uncover these kinds of effects. Okay, so that seems like a clear pattern in the data. So next step in the analysis, now I want to get to the kind of thing that I was talking about. We've established that environment seems to matter in this very local way. Naturally, the next thing you wonder is why? What is different about the places that are helping kids rise up versus the places that are not? There's now a very large literature that's emerged using the data that our team has put out publicly in this opportunity atlas, which if you're interested, you can download yourself. At the census tract level, you can correlate it with various things, look at various different factors. Numerous papers on this have identified many different factors, ranging from poverty rates to the degree of segregation, to measures of family structure, and so forth and so on. I'm going to focus on one, which is what I highlighted, which is the potential importance of social capital. Okay, so both because I think this turned out to be one of the strongest predictors and happens to be one of the frontiers of the field that a lot of people are interested in at the moment. And there's another good illustration of where large-scale data is really helpful to us. So this idea of social capital, some of you probably heard the term, has a long history in social science across, again, many different fields. But it's been used in a very imprecise way, I would argue, where some people mean one thing by social capital, how many friends do you have, or how connected is your community? Others mean something else about how connected are low-income people to high-income people, and so on. Our colleague Bob Putnam here in the Kennedy School has some very well-known work talking about civic engagement and so on as a measure of social capital. So what we did, trying to measure social capital more precisely using the tools of big data, in the era we're in, naturally the kind of thing you think about is social network data. So we set up a collaboration with Meta to use Facebook data to create zip code level measures of social capital in many different forms across the United States, which we've since released publicly. I'm going to summarize the key punchline from this pair of papers published in Nature a couple of years ago in the context of economic mobility. So the map on the left is the map that I've shown you several times. It's this map of upward mobility based on tax record data. The map on the right is completely different. It's based purely on Facebook data, where we're constructing a very simple measure of social capital that we call economic connectedness. We're saying among people who have below median income, we use a machine learning algorithm to predict everyone's income on Facebook. For people with below median income, what fraction of their friends have above median income? So just a simple measure of cross-class interaction. In the map on the right, the blue-green colors are places where low-income people have more high-income friends, where there's more cross-class interaction. And the red colors are places where there's less cross-class interaction. And you can see the result, very clearly for yourself. It's obvious these two things are incredibly strongly correlated. In fact, in a univariate sense, this is by far the single strongest correlation of any factor we or anybody else has looked at of these measures of economic mobility. In places where low-income people are more connected to high-income people, kids from low-income families are more likely to rise up and do well.
Just to make sure I understand, the map on the right has nothing to do with age 35 or age 5 or whatever.
It's
People who currently live there.
Yes.
How are their friends compared to them?
That's right.
Thank you.
That's right. Okay, so one interpretation of this correlation is that there's perhaps a causal effect along the lines of what Nina was saying of the thing on the right on the outcome on the left. Of course, there could be many other things going on. So just to show you what that correlation looks like, first of all, if you just do a simple scatter plot of rates of upward mobility versus this measure of economic connectedness, exactly as you'd expect from those maps, there's a strong relationship between those two things. But if you look at these data, you see, I think, a very intuitive pattern, which is that the places that have the highest levels of economic connectedness tend to be rich cities like San Francisco. Makes sense. You tend to be friends with the people around you. If you're a low-income person in San Francisco, on average, you're going to have more high-income friends than if you live in a place like Indianapolis. Okay. So you might wonder, given that, is it that kids do better in San Francisco because they actually are more connected to high-income people, or is it just that San Francisco is a pretty rich place, has lots of resources, maybe good schools, other things that benefit children? It's not per se about who you're connected to, it's just about the resources in the area. So one way to get at that is to basically use measures of income and average incomes and connectedness to parse those two things out. And what you find, we summarize quickly with this chart here, is the following. So set this up again in a couple of steps. So what we're doing here is plotting this measure of economic connectedness, now at the zip code level, versus first just median household incomes in the zip code. And as I was just saying earlier, there's a clear upward sloping relationship here. As you'd expect, in richer places, poor people tend to have more rich friends. But there's also quite a bit of dispersion vertically. At any given level of income in a neighborhood, there's some places where low-income people are connecting more with high-income people, some places where they're connecting less. So that fact allows us to do the following. Let's now color these dots by the rates of upward mobility from the Opportunity Atlas tax data, where the red colors represent areas, remember, where kids are less likely to rise up, and the blue colors represent places with higher levels of upward mobility. And what you see, I think, is a very striking pattern, which is that if you take any vertical slice of this graph, the colors go systematically from red to blue as you go up, meaning that if you take a set of places, all of which have the same levels of income, but there's more cross-class interaction, you see higher levels of upward mobility. But if you do the opposite exercise and take any horizontal slice of that graph, so go from poorer to richer places, holding fixed the level of cross-class interaction, there's basically no change in the colors, no change in the level of upward mobility. So this is, of course, just a non-parametric depiction of a two-variable regression. But it shows very clearly that it's not that the impact of social capital, this cross-class connection on upward mobility, is simply driven by differences in average levels of income. In fact, not only is it true that controlling for average income, economic connectedness still strongly predicts mobility, the converse is also true in the sense that conditional on economic connectedness, differences in income hardly predict differences in mobility. So we find this pattern, not just for this variable of average incomes, but many other predictors that people have looked at in the past. The social capital measure really seems like the key predictor that explains a lot of other patterns that people have found previously, which is why I think it really seems quite important. Now, why that's the case, is it about people helping someone else out? Is it about children's aspirations changing? If you grow up in a place where nobody's gone to college, maybe you don't even consider that path, nobody's gone into science, maybe you don't even think about that possibility. If you grow up in an environment where more people have done that kind of thing, it changes your own outlook, changes what you try to do. I think all of these are plausible mechanisms, and these are the things we're trying to study at the moment. So in the last part of the talk, and I can remember how much time we have.
Sorry, I was focused on this. You have 8 minutes until 45.
8 minutes until.
Until you're done. We'll begin a bit late. So 13 minutes.
Sounds good. In the remaining few minutes here, what I want to do is talk about how we can take this research knowledge that we've developed to not just write papers about the subject, but actually have an impact in the world on people's lives. And so in our team, we're focusing on 3 different ways of trying to do that I think follow naturally from the kind of evidence I've shown you, that differences in economic mobility emerge at a very granular level. The first is to reduce segregation. If we see that there are higher opportunities 2 miles down the road in a city, maybe we can help more low-income people move to those high opportunity areas. The second, recognizing that you can't move everyone, is to make place-based investments, turn the red-colored parts of the cities into blue-green colors by bringing opportunity to those places. And then the third is making interventions in the higher education system, including at places like Harvard, that I think could do much more to increase economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these and then wrap up. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach. So I just want to give you a very concrete sense of how these data are being used in the real world and can have an impact, I think, and ties again to issues of causal inference. So here I'm showing you a snapshot of the Opportunity Atlas data from Seattle, where we've overlaid in the bright green dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. So as a bit of institutional context, in the US, we spend about $45 billion a year on affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are called housing choice vouchers. They're worth about $1,500 a month of rental assistance in a place like Seattle. So you might notice a puzzling pattern in this map, which is despite the fact that people are getting $1,500 a month from the government, which is intended to help them find housing in a better neighborhood, those dots are concentrated in the red and orange colored parts of the map. People are not moving to places where we've seen from our prior work, they have better chances of escaping poverty. So why is that? When we put out these data publicly, a number of housing authorities and the Housing and Urban Development Agency, the US government approached us and said, why are we seeing this puzzling pattern? Is there something that we can do about it? And so what came out of that was a randomized trial that we ran in Seattle in collaboration with the local housing authorities to test strategies that effectively aim to eliminate the frictions that families might face in moving to high opportunity areas. So think of this as basically like a navigator or brokerage service, someone to help you in the housing search process, would connect you to a landlord, drive you around, find potential listings and so on. Ran it as an RCT in the field, 1,000 families came into a club, get a voucher, 500 were in the control, they just got the voucher, no further support. 500 got this additional assistance that this nonprofit provided, basically trying to eliminate these barriers. We follow these families over time, look at where they end up choosing to live. You see that in the control group, consistent with the map that I was showing you, only 14% of people move to what we define as high opportunity areas based on our maps. In the treatment group, that number jumps to 54%. To give you a sense of the importance of that magnitude, so this treatment is not cheap, costs about $2,500 per family, so it's not inexpensive. But for context, we estimate, based on our prior work, that the kids who got lucky and ended up in the treatment group on average are going to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetime relative to the kids in the control. So from a rate of return perspective, this is incredibly effective. So this is a, yes, please.
Just a quick question, when they use the money in the high opportunity areas, does that take them less, like it's more expensive rent over there?
No, so the vouchers themselves
for-
are, yes, exactly. Exactly, there's a certain amount that you get, and that's the key thing here, that it's not an affordability issue. The key thing seems to be a friction in terms of the actual search process that you're able to relax with a little bit of support. In a way, it reminds me of your earlier comment that, are people informed about where the opportunities are? I think it's not, my view more generally is, as this illustrates, in the federal government, we spend too much time just thinking about how much money we spend on programs and not how you actually deliver that in a way that people will actually be able to use it effectively. And this, I think, illustrates that.
And it's not sort of like, oh, my whole family lives here, so it's not, there's no.
Apparently not, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't see this treatment effect. That was a key thing that we're basically trying to test here. It's not about preferences, it seems to be about frictions.
Is this, so I was wondering, is this about helping them make phone calls, or is this about talking to the landlord saying you should
Yeah.
accept these people?
So we did a bunch of, we teamed up with a sociologist who, with the limitation of the totally quantitative approaches, it's hard to answer questions like that. So she interviewed 250 families, spent a lot of time trying to understand why the program is working. And my sense is it's about meeting different families' challenges depending upon where they are. So there's actually, I think the key point is there's not a single answer to that question. So for some families, they find it very uncomfortable talking to a landlord who's very unfamiliar. They've been rejected a lot in the past. Another family I had the privilege of being able to join some of these visits. It was a mom with 3 kids working 2 jobs. Like there was no way she had the time to drive around to different parts of Seattle and actually do this. Having somebody help you in that moment is incredibly useful.
So it's not landlords that wouldn't take them as tenants unless.
I think
someone
definitely
fancy
there's some
calls them.
convincing of the landlords, but what's interesting is after the trial ended, we were worried that the landlords would no longer want to take the tenants. But actually what the housing authority found is landlords were so happy with the tenants they got that they called and said, got a number of calls saying, this is a really steady stream of rental income. Do you have more people you can send us? So I actually think maybe there's some misperception on the side of landlords. Excellent.
So in the treatment group, we need to be aware of something more than just moving them to these areas, right? Because there could be lots of opportunities, but it's like if the kids from high income families who they are now surrounded by, you're coming in with more resources, so potentially, it would be easier for them to access these opportunities. So does that difference? Do you see an impact of that? Because
Do you see an impact on the low income kids who are moving or on the high income kids?
so there's no for now, eventually they'll be moving into some
Yes.
areas, but then there could still be a barrier to actually being able to avail the opportunities.
That's true,
You're
that's true.
surrounded by people from a different
So,
income, and they're just more prepared.
Absolutely,
so there's
absolutely,
difference among
absolutely.
boundary.
But that's where I would rely on our earlier evidence, where we're actually looking at lower income people in the historical data
Yeah.
to move to those neighborhoods and seeing they do
And see
much
some
better
of it.
in randomized trials with quasi-experimental methods, et cetera. So that's why I show you this after having shown that evidence, otherwise that happened. Okay, so let me press ahead here. So this seems like it works. I want to show you, that this kind of work in the social sciences can actually change things even in the polarized climate that we live in. So after we did this work in Seattle, there was a bill passed with bipartisan sponsors in Congress authorizing $80 million of funding to replicate what we did in Seattle and other cities across America. That's currently in the field. More importantly, there's another bill that's been proposed in Congress, again with the Republican Democratic senator co-sponsoring it, that proposes to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year, which would really have, I think, quite a significant impact across the US. So that's one example of how, obviously it's not the only thing we should do, but it's like one example of how you can use these data to, I think, do constructive things to tackle some of these problems. Let me more briefly now just touch upon these other 2 buckets, because I think in some ways they're more important. Yeah, a minute, yeah. So in the context of place-based investments, I'll be very quick here, I'll give you another example of the kinds of things that people are doing. So sometimes I find just putting out these kinds of data transparently to the public can itself be quite impactful. So when we put out our first study of differences in mobility across areas, basically that first map that I showed you, Charlotte ranked 50th out of the 50 largest cities in America in terms of rates of upward mobility. They were incredibly motivated by that. And they set up a task force and a commission, how is it that we're such a low upward mobility place? What can we do about it? And interestingly, and I think inspiringly, they didn't just talk about it, they actually did something. They invested more than $200 million with nonprofits in trying to address these issues. Private sector companies made commitments to hire kids growing up in disadvantaged families in those communities themselves. There were various public policy changes in zoning laws and so forth. Let me give you an example of, I think, some of the methodological issues that are interesting that arise when people do things like this. So one of the important programs that really took hold in Charlotte after the study was a collaboration between a number of private sector companies in this group called Year Up that's based in Boston that does job training. It's a one-year program that gives people skills needed to get jobs at certain employers. So in prior randomized controlled trials, there's clear evidence that this Year Up program and other so-called sectoral job training programs have really positive effects on people's earnings trajectories, as shown in the green versus the orange. So this looks like a really promising strategy. Now, one paradigm in applied microeconomics is we run a randomized trial like this. We try to kind of conclude, like in sciences, the natural sciences, that something works or it doesn't work, and then we take that to scale. I think in the social sciences, that's a tricky thing to do because the environment makes treatment effects potentially much more unstable. It depends a lot upon context and so on. And so I want to give you an example of some methodology that we're trying to develop that addresses that issue and shows how we can potentially monitor the impacts of these kinds of programs as we're scaling them up in Charlotte and elsewhere, as is happening at present. So the challenge, of course, is we can't run a randomized trial every single time we implement the program in Charlotte and some other city in a different time period and so on. So instead, what we've been working on recently is trying to figure out whether using large-scale data, we can develop matching estimators that approximate the RCT well. So there's an old literature, some of you may know in economics, that argues that observational matching methods tend not to work very well. But that's not a theorem. It obviously depends upon the data you have to construct those matches. And so in the modern era where we have very high dimensional data, we're able to find kids of the exact same race, gender, age, who grew up on in exactly the same census tract. We plot their income trajectories shown in the black here, and you can see it's virtually identical to the randomized control group. So in other words, even if I hadn't run the experiment and I compare the people who participate in the program to this matched control, I would reach basically the same conclusion, which is that on average, there's about a $9,000 gain in earnings 1 year after people participated in the program. Now, why is this useful? What this allows us to do, this kind of validation of a matching estimator, is that it allows us to break out of the confines of the randomized trial to make statements about treatment effects in broader settings. And I think that can be incredibly valuable. So let me give you an illustration of that. So I showed you data from this randomized trial or matching estimator when this Year Up program was implemented in 2014. And that was that $9,000 treatment effect that I just showed you on the previous slide. Now, this program has existed since 2008 and continues to the present. They only ran the RCT in 2014. From a strict randomized trial perspective, we don't have any sense of the treatment effects of the program in other years. But using the matching estimator, we can implement that same matching estimator in earlier and later years, right? And so what you end up getting is this set of estimates of treatment effects, where it's very clear that the treatment effects of the program seem to be going up over time. And I think there's an interesting cautionary tale here. So economists often will say, you're working with talking to somebody who's running a program, oh, you should run an RCT to evaluate whether it's having an impact. If they had followed that advice right when they started the program back in 2008, I think it would have basically killed the program because you would not have found big treatment effects and may not make people it's not working very well. As they refined their model and became better and waited to run the RCT, I think they did it at a time where they were really able to demonstrate impact, and that had a big payoff. So more generally, I think using these quasi-experimental methods, you can not only see these aggregate increases, but importantly, you can discover heterogeneity across different places. So for example, for the same program, in one site, we're seeing quite significant increases, the program's getting better over time, but that's not always true. There's other sites where it's completely flat. And so this kind of evidence can be really useful in understanding, this program seems to be working here and not here, and here's where we need to refine it. And I think there's a lot that we can do in developing methodologies, combining these sorts of data to monitor these programs going forward. So I'm going to skip the last bit where I had some data on Harvard and other places about how I think Harvard is perpetuating inequality across generations. I will skip that. And instead just conclude here by mentioning 3 directions for this audience, the kinds of methodological problems that I see in the space that could be quite impactful. So one, I've spent a lot of time talking about the causal effects of neighborhoods. There have been a number of questions about why that's happening. And I think understanding those causal mechanisms would be very valuable. And bringing richer tools, not just the structured data that I've been focused on here, but especially what we can learn from unstructured data, text, social media, et cetera. Is there more we can learn about what is happening in these high dimensional variation across the cells that I've been showing you? A second, I think, interesting set of methodological questions relates to what's called in the statistics literature surrogate indices. So I'm showing you a lot of evidence on long-term outcomes. Lots of people are implementing interventions now, and inevitably the question we get is somebody has done something 3 years ago and they want to know what effect it's going to have on economic mobility. Now, of course, you can only tell that impact like 20 years from now. Nobody wants to wait that long. Can we come up with good predictors at earlier ages that can give us guidance on what's going to happen in the longer run? I think there are a number of interesting questions there. And then finally, as I was briefly illustrating at the end, I think there's a lot we can do by combining experimental and large-scale observational data, possibly using machine learning methods, more sophisticated version of the matching thing that I was showing at the end there to improve causal inference. And I think that would also have tremendous value. So I hope some of you will be interested in those problems, and I'll stop there.
School by school, like, charter schools, public schools, like anything about a school system makes a difference.
Yeah, so we've done a bunch on schools. I mean, absolutely, there are aspects of schools that matter. So we have one paper, it's called How Does Your Kindergarten Teacher Affect How Much You're Earning When You're 30? Tracking kids from kindergarten, and you see very favorite facts of each childhood teachers, the class size of the classroom you're in. Parents always tell me that I've stressed them out with these studies. But yes, I think all of that matters. Certain types of charter schools seem to be much more effective than others. I think the question is how you can change schools systematically to bring those better inputs to something we're not thinking about on scale.
Talked so American dream from early 1980s to this year.
Well, that in a way relates to the surrogate index question that I was raising at the end, right? So we are measuring kids' incomes when they're 35. So mechanically, you can only see that up to the kids born 35 years ago. In a sense, you'd like to be able to draw that chart out for more recent kids born more recently. But to do that, you need some way to predict where they're going to end up based on earlier indicators. So it's the question you asked is a perfect illustration of the methodological issue that I used to take.
And you also about the trend from the founding of the nation to 1940.
Yeah, so that's another aspect that people have worked on historically, other economic historians. And our sense is that economic mobility was always, it kind of went up from 1860 to 1900, and then was fairly high, and then came back down. It, as you might expect, like varied tremendously across subgroups. So for Black versus white Americans, especially the context of the end of slavery and so on. But some of that data I think is spottier. We're actually doing a big archival project, digitizing information from tapes with the Census Bureau to have a complete longitudinal panel of everybody in America going back 80 years. which will allow us to answer these questions with more predictions.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether this has been done in like countries which are somewhat more homogeneous, though I'm not sure they are, like Korea or something, and South Korea. I
Yeah,
don't know if it is, but that's just a guess that it's somewhat more homogeneous.
yeah, so people are starting to replicate what we've done in the US and many other countries now around the world. Here's one example that speaks to what you were talking about. So Sweden, at least traditionally more homogeneous country. If you look at the variance, Swedish kroner here is 7 kroner per dollar roughly. There's just much less variance across places. It matters much less where you grow up in Sweden than it does in the US. There's just much less heterogeneity in outcomes. Part of it may be because of homogeneity, not just because it's a homogeneous population, but because I think that leads to more uniform provision of schooling, public goods, et cetera, than the fragmented.
Sort of one more question, which was about the matching that you did.
Yeah.
I think it seems to me that it would be very important what qualities you chose, like you chose to match with, and then,
Yes.
so did you try different and it didn't match well with others, and so that
Yes.
seems crucial, like.
Absolutely, yeah, and I mean, that's where I think like machine learning techniques could themselves be useful, right? You could try to train to generate treatment effects that match the truth at some level and pick a set of covariates that would get you there. That's not what we did. We basically started from the coarse matching that people did traditionally. It was just like in a survey, incredibly coarse. You're just taking people like basically of the same race within a 20-year age span. That like works terribly. Then you start to hone in and you can say narrower range bins, I use location, I use gender and so on. And then it starts to become clearer that it works better. Now I should note that that's just one example. This is kind of in progress. We're trying to answer your question more systematically across many different studies. Can we come up with some guidance on what seems like it will work in general? That's really the question.
This is probably a silly question, but and it's more like about the interventions. I have no experience in economics, but is there sometimes an effect where something works well when it's a small program? Once everyone has access to it, then, for example, you're less special, and so like there's an interference right happening about.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, the traditional economics way of thinking about that would be just general equilibrium effects, that things change in the economy more broadly when you bring things to scale. There could be other mechanisms through which when you scale something, it somehow loses its specialness for that person. If there's like a relative comparison kind of model or something like that. My instinct is that like, if I take something like the moving to opportunity, like I would be worried about doing that on a massive scale. Obviously, if you move all the low income people to where the high income people live and all the high income people where all the low income people live, you're not going to achieve anything. So there's got to be a limit to the scaling of that sort of thing. My sense is we're so far away from that if we ever get to that sort of problem, I would worry about it at that point. That's not a great scientific answer to your question, but I think, to really answer that question rigorously from a data-based perspective, the only way I can think of doing it is from a more model-driven approach, where you have some model of how the world works, because you don't actually have within the data that scale of variation. So you have some theory of peer effects or something else, and how linear or non-linear that production function looks like, and then you can make some prediction about when these things are going to tip. But I think the honest truth is nobody really knows. We're barely starting to understand these partial equilibrium, like individual small scale effects. Cool.
Wonderful, let's thank Raj.